Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. Today we're looking at the campaigns of Hammurabi of Babylon. Yes, that Hammurabi, who ruled from about 1792 to around 1750 BCE. Now the first thing you might have noticed is I didn't name a specific battle just now. That's because, as I was researching today's battle, which was supposed to be the Siege of Hiratum in 1764 BCE, I learned we have a fair bit of general information on Hammurabi and the major wars he fought as Babylonian king. But we don't have nearly as much on the battles that made up those wars. So we're going to talk about the battles we know about, but rather than giving you another episode of, well, we know the battle happened and we know who won, but that's about it, I figured it might be better to give you an overview of what we do know. So today we're going to talk about King Hammurabi of Babylon and the wars we know he fought. The Elamite War in about 1764 BCE, the Larsa War in about 1763 BCE, the Eshnunna War in about 1762 BCE, the Mari War in about 1761 BCE, and his last campaign, the conquest of the Assyrians, shortly before his death in 1750 BCE. That's a busy fella. Let's look a little deeper. And of course, before we can do that, we need to set up a little background. If you were with us for the sack of Ur in 2004 BCE, you might remember that the kings of the Ur III dynasty built a big wall between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to keep out the folks they considered undesirables. One of the peoples that wall was supposed to keep out was the Amorites, a coalition of nomadic tribes who lived in the Syrian desert north and west of Sumer. Well, that wall worked about as well as you'd expect. The Amorites and Elamites and all their friends managed to get into Sumer in spite of it, and in 2004 BCE, the Elamites carried Ibbi-Sin, the last king of Ur III, off in chains. And around 1894 BCE, the Amorites set themselves up in a shiny new city they called Babylon. And that's another name you probably recognize. Babylon sits on the east bank of the Euphrates, 50 or 60 miles south of Baghdad and a little west of Kish. Apparently, the archaeology of the city hasn't been well preserved because of a high water table. That's a pain in the ass for us, but it would have been great for the Babylonians. A high water table means wells are easy to dig, which means plenty of water, which is kind of important in a region as hot as Mesopotamia. The first 5 Amorite kings of Babylon seem to have been pretty content sitting back on their plentiful water and not stirring up too much shit. They conquered the nearby towns of Kish and Dilbat and Silbar and built a wall around their city, but they don't seem to have gone in for much in the way of conquest outside their local region. I guess you could say they were good neighbors. Until the 6th king, Hammurabi, took over. It looks like Hammurabi may have taken the throne as co-ruler while his father, Sin-Muballit, was still ruling, or at least still alive. I can't find any information on how old he was at the start of his reign, but it could be that his father stepped down or was forced to abdicate in his favor, but stuck around to advise him until he was old enough to rule in his own right. Hammurabi had a good long rule of 42 years, which means he probably couldn't have been much into his 20s when he became king and might have been a kid. Here's a note that we'll come back to in a few minutes. It's possible that a southern kingdom called Yamatbal, whose capital was the city of Larsa, was the power that forced Hammurabi's father to abdicate. If that's true, it goes a long way to explaining the motivation behind at least one of Hammurabi's conquests. So he spent his first 20 or so years getting a handle on things in Babylon and the immediate region. He restored and improved the temples where the city's gods were supposed to live, strengthened the city walls, improved irrigation, and created the famous code of laws that we know him for. It turns out his code isn't the oldest we know of, but it was a little different from the codes that came before it. Where the older codes talk about paying restitution to the victims, Hammurabi's code talks about punishing the offender, and he had a very literal idea of letting the punishment fit the crime. So, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, these were very specific punishments in Hammurabi's code. So, he spent almost 30 years improving his people's lives. Legend, right? Then, the Elamites attacked, and the gloves came off. You might remember the Elamites from the sack of Ur, or maybe from the episode on Sargon of Akkad. These guys from the mountains east of the Tigris in present-day Iran had been a pain in the Sumerians' asses for at least 200 years by Hammurabi's time. And in the early 1760s BCE, they invaded again. They struck in the north first, taking the city of Eshnunna on the upper Tigris, possibly with the help of the city of Mari. They marched north in 1766 BCE, laying siege to the city of Rizama, but they couldn't take it. Then they turned south, setting their sights on lower Mesopotamia. Hammurabi decided he wasn't going to let them have it. Because not only had Hammurabi spent his early reign improving his city and making his people's lives better, he'd also been busy improving his army. Unfortunately, it's not clear to me exactly what those improvements were, but there are a few general guesses we can make. Right about this period is when we start seeing the shift from the old Sumerian war wagons to lighter two-wheeled chariots. We also see a shift from onagers to horses to pull them, so these two changes probably went hand in hand. This gave him a chariot that was faster and more agile than what most of his adversaries would have had. We also see evidence that people were riding horses in this period. The earliest image from Mesopotamia of a human riding a horse comes from around 2000 BCE. So it probably wasn't even a particularly new concept by 1766 BCE. But it's the first time we've had a chance to talk about it. No horses in battle yet, though. It looks like they were using horse-drawn light chariots and mounted messengers, but no real cavalry yet. That's still 500 or 600 years in the future by this point. He also figured out how to dam up rivers. That's going to be important here in a couple of years, so stick with me. The bottom line is that the Elamites had no idea they were about to run into a shitstorm of biblical proportions. No shit, there they were. The Elamites crossed the Tigris with their Eshnunnan allies, and probably others at a city called Upi, but I can't figure out where Upi was. Then they laid siege to a city called Hiratum, whose location is also a mystery to me, but both cities were apparently close enough to Babylon to make Hammurabi nervous. So he sent messages to his fellow kings across Mesopotamia, asking for alliances and troops so he could do them all a favor and kick the Elamites out for him. He must have gotten at least some of the troops he was asking for, because in 1764 BCE, he marched to relieve Hiratum. And this is where the damming up rivers comes in. Because the Elamites had built siege ramps, which are exactly what they sound like. Earthen ramps up to the walls of a fortress or fortified city, intending to give the attackers an easy approach up to the top of the walls. More secure than ladders, and capable of carrying much more traffic. Now try to imagine the amount of work that goes into building a siege ramp in the Bronze Age. If the walls are 40 feet high, and your guys can climb up a 30-degree slope, which is probably a lot steeper than you want it to be, but we're going to stick with that just to make the math easier. Your ramp has to be about 70 feet long. If the top is 8 feet wide so you can drive a chariot or a cart up it, the base probably has to be 25 or 30 feet wide. I'm not an engineer, and I'm not going to try and figure out the math to calculate the volume of that shape. But I hope you can agree with me that that's several metric shit tons of rock and dirt your guys have to carry to the site, set in place, and pack down until the ramp is strong enough to support the weight of the hundreds of armed dudes you're going to have running up to the top of it. And you don't have steel shovels or picks or anything. They have to scoop the dirt up into baskets, carry it on donkey carts, and stomp it down with their feet. How many weeks of work go into piling up one siege ramp? And here comes Hammurabi with his coalition. dams up the river, then breaks the dam and washes all the siege ramps and equipment away. There was probably a battle afterward with Hammurabi and his allies duking it out in the field below Hieratum with the Elamites and their allies. If there was a military force inside Hieratum still capable of fighting, and that's not a sure thing since we really don't know anything about the details of the siege, like how long the people inside the city had been sealed inside or what kind of food and water reserves they had. But if there were still a military force inside the city that could fight, they might have taken part, if only to grab a share of the glory of kicking the Elamites out of their city. But I can't say for sure whether there was a battle, although it looks like Hammurabi at least helped the defenders by hitting the Elamites in the rear. But whatever happened, it convinced the Eshnunans to pack their shit and go home. The Elamites, now outnumbered in enemy territory, decided their best bet was to follow suit. So they headed back to Elam by way of Eshnunna, sacking the city on their way. Which left Hammurabi in the field, probably having just added Hieratum to his kingdom, with a big-ass army and no particular inclination to send it home. So he turned south, because it turns out that Larsa, a city between the rivers near Uruk, had responded to his request for troops by offering an alliance. But when Hammurabi accepted the alliance, they sent no troops. And as you may recall, Larsa may just have been responsible for Hammurabi's father's abdication. So Hammurabi decided it was high time Larsa got a boot in the ass. He laid siege to Larsa in 1763 BCE with an army in the neighborhood of 40,000. He may have repeated his trick with the dam, either to cut off the city's water or to flood it. Whether or not that's true, he seems to have taken the city after about 6 months. So, by 1762 BCE, he had added Hieratum and Yamatbal, which if you'll remember is the state that Larsa was the capital of, to Babylon's growing empire. But he had kept his allies' armies in the field with him in the south for 2 years after their alliance was supposed to have expired, and his northern allies were starting to have trouble with aggressive local tribes, as well as some members of the coalition that had allied itself with Elam and Eshnunna back in 64. Mari, in particular, was getting loud in its demands that he send their troops back, or even better, march north himself to help them. Well, Hammurabi seems to have gotten a taste for conquest by that point, or maybe he enjoyed the campaigning life, or maybe he figured it was high time somebody took control and stopped all this fighting between cities. Or maybe he had a mother-in-law back in Babylon that he wanted to avoid for a little while longer. At any rate, he decided not just to send Mari's troops home, but to go with them. And instead of going straight north to Mari, he decided to go to Eshnunna instead. He might have sent envoys to the Elamite king to warn him to stay out of Mesopotamian affairs for a while he took care of business. But whether he did or not, it doesn't look like Elam interfered with what came next. It's entirely possible he had hurt him badly enough at Hieratum that they decided not to go up against him again, at least not without significant changes to the rules of the game. So Hammurabi marched on Eshnunna, probably used his dam trick again, and may have destroyed the city instead of simply conquering it. Now, it's not entirely clear to me what destroyed means in the context of the ancient Near East. We've seen quite a few examples of cities that are supposed to have been destroyed, but seem to be major players again only a decade or so later. But destroyed is one of the words I've seen to describe what Hammurabi did to Eshnunna in 1761 BCE. And after he finished there, I guess he figured he'd come this far, might as well turn west and keep going. By now you gotta figure Mari knew what was coming. So Hammurabi either took Mari without a fight, or he pulled his dam trick on it like everywhere else, or he destroyed it. I've seen all three used to describe what he did there. But by the time he was finished with Mari, he pretty much controlled every major city in Mesopotamia. It took him a few years to finish consolidating his conquest, particularly in Eshnunna and Yamatbal. But by 1755 BCE, he had done something no other conqueror had managed to do. He was the undisputed ruler of all of Mesopotamia. And if his accomplishments in Babylon are any indication, it seems likely the Mesopotamians were the better for the change. He even turned his attention against the Assyrians to the north, but by that time it doesn't look like he had the energy to pursue a full conquest. He forced one king off the throne and forced his successor to pay him tribute, but the Assyrians never really submitted to Hammurabi's rule. But there's a downside to the accomplishments of a genius, ambitious, vigorous conqueror. People like that tend to be control freaks, and because they're very good at whatever they decide to accomplish, folks tend not to spend too much effort second-guessing them. But they also don't learn how to do it themselves either. And eventually the genius isn't there anymore, and nobody else has quite the same combination of talents to hold things together. And unless the conqueror took care to put strong systems in place to keep things going, their accomplishments tend not to last long after they're gone. Which is just what happened to Hammurabi's empire, sometimes called the Old Babylonian Empire. Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, and his son, Samsu-iluna, just doesn't seem to have been up to the task of governing such a large empire. City-states all over Mesopotamia, threatened from outside the empire, started holding on to their troops and treasure and, well, acting like independent states just like they had before the conquest. In a century and a half after Hammurabi's death, the Hittites sacked Babylon, and the last of his empire was gone. We'll talk about that battle too. But we'll get to that in another episode. And, like so many of these Bronze Age battles, we don't know enough about any of Hammurabi's battles to do a proper evaluation. As great captains go, he seems to have done pretty well, but other than his win-loss record, we just don't have enough information to talk about what kind of general he was. So no evaluation against the principles for Hammurabi, as ironic as that seems. Thanks for joining me today. If you got a kick out of this episode, send me a thumbs up and subscribe, and remember to tell your friends about us. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.